During the early parts of the Second World War in Europe, the Germans captured many Allied vessels, including Danish, Dutch, Belgian, French, and Norwegian vessels. But I want you to imagine you're in the German Admiralty in 1940. Naval bases are under air attack, and you need quick solutions. AA guns alone are too slow to install, so converting available ships, old German, Dutch, Danish, and Norwegian vessels, into Flak ships provides immediate mobile defenses. It's important to note the Germans confused matters by renaming Dutch and Norwegian ships after their own old cruisers that had been decommissioned. Today, we'll discuss how the Germans used these captured vessels to defend ports and even some of their most important ships. On May 10, 1940, the Netherlands was attacked by Germany and surrendered on the 15th. Much of the home-based elements of the Dutch Navy had been evacuated to the United Kingdom, meaning the Germans only captured a few vessels, a pair of coastal defense ships and a cruiser. To a greater or lesser extent, these vessels had been sabotaged. All three were converted to flak ships. The first two converted were the coastal defense ships, the Ariadne, the ex-Hertog Hendrik, and Undine, the ex-Jacob von Heemskerke. These ships were part of a series of coastal defense ships that the Dutch had built dating back to the late 19th century, and in this case, Ariadne was built in 1902 and Undine was built in 1906, and were used primarily in a training role. That's not to say that they weren't updated throughout their lengthy careers, as they served training sailors of the Dutch Navy all the way up until 1939. As war loomed, the Dutch vessels, old as they were, couldn't assist in a frontline role at sea. Instead, they were used as floating batteries, using their array of guns, 24cm and 15cm guns, in the defense of the Netherlands. Still, for the Ariadne, that didn't last long, as she was turned into an accommodation ship. Both Ariadne and Undine were scuttled as German forces advanced into the country, with Undine being bombed by the RAF with considerable flooding. Still, the ships could be patched and returned to service with minimal effort, along with the cruiser Gelderland, which we'll discuss more in a bit. To take from Aidan Dodson and Dirk Nodelman in their article from Warships 2025, they write, "It was as early as May 14th that a decision was made to convert the two coast defense ships, and the cruiser Gelderland into flak ships, along with general lines of Arcona, Medusa, Nymph, and Thetis. However, it was explicitly stated that the conversion work on the ex-Dutch vessels was to be on an as-and-when basis, keeping yard workforces occupied when no other jobs were available. This was in part owing to the lack of manpower to crew the vessels. However, the ship's guns were removed immediately, the 24cm weapons being installed for coast defense in Battery Rosenberg on the island of Beer Peninsula on the southern side of the Maas estuary at the Hook of Holland. The initial proposals for the conversions was completed by Kiel Dockyard on October 30th, 1941, followed by two variants in December and in April 1942. Preparation work for Ariadne commenced in August, and Undine was converted between 1942 and 1943. Both ships were rebuilt to the same basic design. Their armament was agreed in September 1942 to consist of a mixed battery of heavy and light AA guns, but compared to earlier conversions, the larger deck area of the Dutch coast defense ships allowed the mounting of two additional heavy flat guns, giving a total of 8 10.5cm guns. Single 10.5cm mountings were fitted on the forecastle and quarter deck, 3 being placed on a superimposed platform forward and 1 in a corresponding aft position. A pair of 1.5cm guns were installed just abaft the break in the forecastle. Pairs of single 4cm guns were fitted on a platform behind and above the superimposed 10.5cm guns, while 2cm quadruple mountings were placed at the bow, stern, and amidships. The latter guns were placed on platforms and on the sides of the towers. The ships were also fitted with all sorts of radar and fire control equipment, along with searchlights and other manner of equipment. Interestingly enough, their propulsion had been stripped considerably, and to save time, it was not restored, and they were given new machinery to provide the necessary power for the equipment on board. The two ships looked pretty similar, but there were some distinguishing features, noticeably their director towers and superstructures. Looking at their careers, Unine was commissioned on September 29, 1943 at Hamburg. Immediately afterwards, she was towed to Cuxhaven for ammunitioning. After some jostling about where the ship was to go, people wanted her to go to Gdynia to protect the harbor, and others wanting her to be off Peenemünde in the northeastern part of Germany. Those wanting her there got their wish as Naval High Command ordered her there, positioning the ship southeast of Peenemünde, while officially attached to the nearby naval base at Swinemünde. She would remain there, with some breaks going to Stettin to protect the synthetic oil factories there. For the protection of the Politz plant, she was moored in the confined delta of the Oder River until February 1945, when Naval Commander-in-Chief Karl Dönitz decided to employ her slightly farther north at Swinemünde, which had become the focal point for the mission to save civilians from the Baltic. However, that was not her final location, which was near Travemünde, north of Lübeck. This is where she was at the time of surrender. As for Ariadne, in light of Germany's worsening air defense situation in 1943, the OKM decided on November 11th to speed up the conversion of the ships Ariadne and the Ex-Gelderland. Ariadne was intended for service in the Baltic, while the Ex-Gelderland was to operate in Norway. 1 month later, the OKM approved the initial list of equipment for both, which was to follow the design of Unine. Despite the efforts, Ariadne was not complete at Antwerp until March 31, 1944, and was formally commissioned on April 4th. Ariadne remained at Antwerp until she was towed to Brunsbüttel in May of 1944. From May 20th to June 30th, she was moored near the Kiel Canal locks, after which she was relieved by the Arkona. Between the 6th and 7th of August, she transferred to the Putzige Weik, replacing Naobi Ex-Gelderland, just as the Undine had been expected to do the previous year. Ariadne stayed in the area until March 1945, when she moved west to join Undine at Travemünde on April 17th. Both vessels were then towed to Wilhelmshaven by the end of May 1945. On August 12, 1945, Ariadne and Undine were moored together in Nordhafen, opposite the fourth entrance. They were later joined by Arkona and Medusa while awaiting tow back to the Netherlands. It's uncertain when Ariadne returned home, but records show that Undine arrived at Den Helder at the end of February 1946, under tow by the tugs Tyne and Amsterdam. Interestingly, newspaper reports from that period referred to her as Hertog Hendrik, suggesting some confusion about which of the former coast defense ships had been recovered. Moving on swiftly to the Naobi, the Ex-Gelderland, she was a 4,000-ton cruiser launched in the late 1890s, being refitted in the 1920s to be a gunnery training ship. Following the defeat of Dutch forces in the capture of the vessel, under German control, the ship initially remained at Den Helder as an accommodation ship. However, in August of 1941, she was transferred to a shipyard near Rotterdam, as I literally can't pronounce it. I'll put it up on screen now, and hopefully some Dutch folks in the comments will be able to give me a proper pronunciation. Anyway, she was there for a low-priority conversion into a flagship, following the same general plan as Ariadne and Undine. Unlike those vessels, her machinery was still functional, so it was decided that she would operate under her own power, similar to the ex-Norwegian ships Nymph and Thetis. Her original engines were retained, but the number of Yarrow boilers was reduced from 12 to 6, 3 in each boiler room. This modification allowed the funnel uptakes to be merged into a single funnel. Her armament matched that of the other ex-Dutch conversions, though her live ammunition load of 950 shells included 150 non-anti-aircraft rounds, reflecting her expected role in surface engagements as a sea-going unit. Conversion work was completed at the end of February 1944, and the ship was commissioned on March 1st as the Naobi. Naobi had a very short funnel and light mast of Undine, but concerns regarding her stability are suggested by the fact while still at Rotterdam, The original mounted quick launch davits for 2 motor launches on both sides of the funnel were replaced by lighter, hand-operated davits serving poling cutters. Anyway, she was further modified in Germany for service as a flagship. The main modification included raising the height of the funnel and the level of the searchlights, enhancing splinter protection for the guns, and strengthening and converting the mast into a tripod design. The steering position was also relocated from the upper superstructure deck to a point about 1.5 decks higher, on the front of the tower that supported the 6-meter director and rangefinder. This new position provided a much clearer field of view than the original, which had been obstructed by the 3 10.5-centimeter guns surrounding it. Although Naobi had initially been intended for deployment in Norwegian waters, she served instead in the Baltic throughout her brief German career. The ship's planned functions had included the escort of coastal convoys, but in practice, she was employed in a static role in Putzige Wijk. However, as the Soviets advanced on the Finnish front, in June of 1944, she was transferred to Kotka on the Gulf of Finland, a base for light forces guarding minefields across the Gulf. The Finnish Air Force having withdrawn local air cover to meet even more urgent requirement, Naobi was to be used to bolster the shore-based anti-aircraft guns. She arrived on July 10th, and her presence was detected by the Soviets 2 days later, on the 12th. Mistakenly, they identified her as the Finnish coastal defense ship Väinämöinen, a long-standing target of interest. An immediate attack was ordered. 30 PE-2 dive bombers escorted by 24 Yak-9 fighters dropped about 70 bombs ranging from 500 to 1,000 kilograms each, but none found their mark. A second airstrike, codenamed Operation Hurricane, took place on the 16th and involved no fewer than 132 Soviet aircraft, the largest single Soviet air attack of the entire war. The initial wave consisted of 23 IL-2s, ground attack planes, armed with bombs, all of which missed. They were followed up by 28 PE-2s, carrying 250-kilogram bombs, and escorted by 16 fighters, who also failed to score hits. The final wave included 4 Douglas A-20C aircraft, each equipped with a 1,000-kilogram bomb, preceded by high-flying PE-2s intended to distract the defenders. This deception succeeded. At around 5 p.m., 2 of the 1,000-kilogram bombs from the A-20C struck the cruiser below the starboard waterline. The damage was catastrophic. Naobi listed heavily to starboard and sank, leaving only her superstructure and funnel above the water. Of the crew, 260 were rescued, but around 70 perished. In return, the Soviets claimed that around 4 A-20Cs were shot down during the attack. After the sinking, much of Naobi's armament and ammunition was recovered. 7 of her 10.5-centimeter guns were taken into Finnish service. The 8th had been too badly damaged to repair, and remained in use until the 1990s. The wreck itself stayed in place until 1953, when salvage operations were hampered by leftover ammunition. Eventually, a Hamburg salvage firm refloated the hull, which was then scrapped. To take from Aidan Dodson and Dirk Nodelman, in their article from Warships 2023, they write, "At the time of the German invasion of Norway in April 1940, the largest ships of the Norwegian Navy were 4 coastal defense ships, built in pairs in the UK at the end of the 19th century. 2, Norge and Eidsvold, 1900, were sunk by German destroyers on the first day of the attack, April 9th, but the other pair, Tordenskjold and Harald Hårfagre, were captured intact, laid up at Horten Dockyard, and later that same day, both were taken in hand for conversion to anti-aircraft vessels. Still, as the machinery was in good order, both would be capable of self-propulsion, and would have perhaps the most prominent part in the war of all the conversions. The 2 ships were laid down in the late 19th century and had 21-centimeter, 12-centimeter, and 76-centimeter guns, with machinery to make around 17 knots. They weren't bad ships, just old. They served in a variety of roles until the outbreak of war, where they were captured in the spring of 1940. Being virtually undamaged, the ships were selected for conversion work into Flak ships during the summer of 1940, with the work beginning in October. Tordenskjold became the Nymph, and Horfarge became the name Thetis. And thank God I can use these names now, because the Norwegian language is insane. Anyway, the ships recommissioned into German service in February 1941. All existing armaments were removed, and single 10.5cm 45 caliber guns were placed on the forecastle and quarterdecks as in Arkona and Medusa, another two ships we discussed previously. Being larger vessels from the outset, Nymph and Thetis carried two more guns of this caliber in superimposed positions. According to the original plans, there were to be 8 short-barreled 4cm cannons of an unknown origin, 4 replacing the original 12cm weapons, and 4 abreast the bridge. But in the event of similar short-barreled 2cm guns were planned to be substituted in all but 2 cases. This would be amended shortly after more modern German AA guns of the same caliber were placed. Directors with 3-meter rangefinders were planned to be fitted atop the original bridgework and on top of a platform on the cut-down mainmast. These were certainly fitted in Thetis, but photos of Nymph made it unclear if she ever carried them. Tall lattice structures fore and aft of the funnel were shortened by 2 meters. Each originally supported a single searchlight. Still, the forward model was later exchanged for a pair of smaller side-edged units in Nymph. Taking from Dodson and Nodelman again. A major difference between the sisters, as converted, was that Thetis had a tripod mast installed aft of the funnel, a feature never present in Nymph. Also, the latter did not have the shelter deck built out to the ship's sides abreast the funnel. In Thetis, the shelter deck extension supported the ship's boats. In Nymph, these were carried out on davits. At the end of her career, Nymph had her forward lattice structure significantly heightened, presumably to receive radar, although it is uncertain whether this was ever installed. Her after lattice structure was shortened at the same time, probably as top weight compensation. These modifications were not carried out in Thetis, although the forward searchlight platform was empty at the end of the war. Information on the careers of the two ships is incomplete, with some confusion regarding their individual histories, so take what I say with a grain of salt. Thetis is generally reported to have joined Marine Flak Oppteilung 709 based at Horstad, Norway, but from the outset, several images taken at different times indicate by changing in her camouflage scheme contradict this. Most images instead show her at Kiel, while another source claims that she was employed at Flensburg from February 1941, protecting the Naval Academy as well as the town and local shipyard against air raids coming from the Flensburg Fjord. This deployment seems to have lasted until December 1942, with a confirmed stint at Kiel in October, when Thetis was reported to have been located at Kristiansand, Norway, finally on her way north. Nymph was first reported as having been attached to Marine Flak Oppteilung 214 at Kiel, which may reflect a mix-up in names. However, what is certain is that in May 1942, she was transferred to Norway to join Marine Flak Oppteilung 710 at Tromsø. Her first station was in the Oslofjord near Narvik, where she helped defend the anchorage at Bogan Bay. When Tirpitz shifted her anchorage from Bogan Bay to the fleet anchorage at Oslofjord during 1943, both Nymph and Thetis were redeployed there to provide anti-aircraft cover. Their strong flak batteries played a vital role during the British midget submarine raid in September 1943, which caused severe shock damage and temporarily disabled much of Tirpitz's main battery. After Scharnhorst's loss in December 1943, Thetis was stationed for a time at Skillinfjord, opposite Sternsund, positioned to use her rapid-firing guns against any small craft that might try to enter Altafjord through the narrow passage. Ultimately, in October 1944, both Thetis and Nymph moved with Tirpitz to Tromsø, but they were unable to stop the battleship's destruction in the bombing of November 12, 1944. Despite claims in some sources, both vessels were named in northern Norway at the time of Germany's surrender. Nymph was lying at Svolvær when Norwegian authorities ordered her to Narvik, carrying her German crew along with troops from the Luften Islands to surrender formally. Shortly after sailing, however, on May 17, 1945, she was deliberately sabotaged by a reportedly drunken German crew, who opened several seacocks, forcing her to beach at Kuna Meloy. She sank in shallow water with her upper deck awash. In 1948, she was sold to be broken up, raised, and scrapped there. One of her anchors is preserved today outside Lofton War Memorial Museum in Svolvær. Thetis, meanwhile, ended the war near Horstadt, where she was present during the May 4, 1945 bombing of the harbor and Operation Judgment. She was returned intact to Norwegian control, served briefly as an accommodation ship, and in 1947 was sold to be scrapped, being dismantled the following year. Now, this section was going to be all about the Danes, but the details weren't very exciting as the ships weren't converted, and I didn't think it'd be worthwhile to discuss the matter. Well, there you have it, captured vessels the Germans used during the Second World War. It's a fascinating subject, something I don't think gets talked about much, and I think it's generally unknown. Let me know what you thought about the vessels below. Anyway, please remember to like and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.